Hi, this is Daniel Ziegler, and in this video I will be demonstrating some of the features of my model viewer and my model converter. There we go. Now, I'm going to start off with the model viewer by just running it in Visual Studio. As you can see, I have models from each group displaying. I just decided to go with the recommended models because I'm boring and I was pressed for time. But as you can see, I've got the Astro Boy model showing here. Okay, now I'm inside of it. The Buggy model, which is also showing from the bottom as well as the top. And if I look from side to side and then I switch to camera, you will notice that any bounding spheres that are not in my view are empty. But not only that, the models are also not showing at all. The spheres are red and the models are absent. They're not being drawn. So I've just noticed that I am leaking memory, and that is very bad. I will get back to that in a bit. But anyway. All of that works. In addition, I also have the null texture right here, and that one is not being referred to by name. I simply have a texture that does not exist listed there, and so it displays that by default. Anyway, I'll show some of the features here before I debug this just a bit to get rid of that memory leak. Anyway. The cameras are set up as before. I do still have the models being loaded independently of the actual graphics objects. Again, that's something I do have to work on. But at any rate, as you can see, I just need to create a simple game object and list all the details of it. So I do not have to create a separate graphics object or a separate model or anything. Also, the bounding spheres, I can just do it with a single function, giving the game object and the name. As for the ways that these files are written, I actually use the eat function from assignment 1, and this will basically read all the different sections. So in the most of this is done in the model file. So if you check here and say simple model, it will check for the model info, which is info that contains things like the number of vertices and number of triangles, default texture, and default shader, also verts, UVs, norms, try list, and it can even list the. So yeah, all of this is going to be stored in the actual model files. These are packages containing not only the models but also the textures. The shaders are still independent since they are shared between a lot of different models. I didn't want to restrict them to any one, but things like the warebear, which includes both the warebear and polar bear textures, are there. As for the converter, it is listed right here. Most of the code is pretty familiar. It's the same as the stuff we had in the demos, but I did make quite a few changes. There have been things like I had the ability to convert Azul files. The verbose option will actually print out all the text like it did before in the converter. Well, not converter, but in the sample code. Without it on, this doesn't actually have any output. It simply converts the file. That might be a thing I'll want to change. But it also has the option to include the texture or not include the texture. If you don't include the texture, it'll simply not create a separate chunk for that. -T allows you to specify specific textures to include. By default, the converter will simply look through the FBX file for textures associated with the model, and we'll simply add those. If you add, say, -T and then give a texture name, it'll add that to the list of textures to pack into the final package. You can specify the default shader here. You need to use the base shader file name. You can convert a file in the old format, Azul, to the new one, and you can also export texture. This one doesn't serve too much purpose since it effectively simply copies the texture somewhere else, since it is not actually reading any textures from the FBX file, but that is an option. You can also export a texture while also including it in the package. Finally, you can give the version string for the final package file. Anyway, I should probably change this just a bit. Anyway, some of the other methods called things into like display texture or display mesh will also have counterparts that simply do the same thing without printing anything out. So things like, I call those get texture and get mesh, for instance. As for the actual file, I have a couple of different inclusions. Let me see this. Here we go. Write chunks is the main body of it. It'll simply write out the data that has been collected, say the model info, which is its own struct, verts, which is the array of vertices, UVs, norms, and trilist, and we'll simply write those out to binary files, which it then executes vodka on to pack them into individual chunks. It also does this for the textures. So this uses a modified version of the vodka and LIU functions from assignment 1. The only difference is that instead of using command line arguments, these have their own arguments that you pass into the function. This information is also included in a text file that's in the same folder, along with the batch file that does this. So I'm going to show you an example of me converting one of these. Okay, so this usage here I'll use is I'll convert the frigate model just as an example. So PA3 minus include texture space frigate.fbx space frigate.spu. It attempts to delete any existing binary files and BLO files before it does it, and it also tries to just delete any existing file with the same name. Now, if I go to this folder here, you will see that I now have the spacefrigate.spu file right here, and it contains the model, the texture. It even lists the default shader and default texture in there. So those are the basics of the converter and viewer. I hope it was to your liking, and I'm going to fix some of those bugs and submit this. Thank you very much.